warm welcome back to Think Tech Hawaii's Humane Architecture, our show. This happening to be to our 285th show. And thanks to our producer, Ash, he brings up which accumulated viewer you are, which we appreciated. And we are DeSoto Brown from nearby his home at Diamond Head, and me just below him in the Waikiki Grand in Waikiki as Waikiki Grand, yes. And we are looking into another city as to broaden our mind, as to get our mind not being incestuously island isolated, although we are faking it that we're at two different places, but we want to get our minds even more out. And that gets us to a city that we're recently importing the majority of high-rises from authorship-wise, and that is the city of Chicago. See you soon for that. All right, DeSoto, to get the audience an idea where that Chicago is, we put two things up there. One, most importantly, the map. This is what everyone can do, and we encourage them because that's what we did on our phones. We Google map it, and we see it. And there's also water next to it. And the water, however, is to the right. And usually if you don't mess with it, north is always up on these devices. So we don't do the north arrow here because it's defaulting back to that. So the water is to the right and the city is to the left. So that means in a situation of what we always have here in the summers, right, where it's always hot, and it's hot over there too. And we have to say that we're both familiar with this area because I grew up in such a climate to begin with in Germany, similar. And then Chicago was my hub in and out from my adopted home away from home in Nebraska. And your family was mean enough to send you out there, not far away, when you were a young child. So we both know very well what that climate is about, right?
Yes, we do. Yes, we do.
Probably for a reason we are here now. And because the summers are actually more brutal there. They're more humid and they can actually be more hot. So this pretty silly postcard here from us here, which is named The Golden Sunsets of Honolulu. That's a very postmodern approach because you're sitting behind glass. And if you don't have your AC blasting where you burn your oil or gas, fossil fuels, then you get baked. And in Chicago, that happens then not in the afternoon as it does here, but in the morning. That's the main difference. But then, according to the news on the left, we also have that situation that we have going on right now. Our guest in our other show that we're reconnecting to next week with Matt Noblet, he's in Boston. That's just one over to the east. Hopefully he's safe because he's in an airplane. I had to be de-iced, not me, but my plane, the wings of my plane multiple times when I try to get in and out of Chicago, and I don't miss that. So we just want you, the audience, to keep that in mind when we're talking, because next slide. Although we had a tour guide, a preview of it from the Dome Publisher series as a guide, and that is a reference for us because we were asked to do the one about our Honolulu, which we are deeply into it. And although that guide was very helpful to me, but what I was missing, and that's what we want to do better with ours, that we want to keep climate in mind when we are writing about it. We want to write about it as if we would be in it with fossil fuel down, which, you know, there were times when there was no fossil fuel that you're closer related to than I am because of your work in the Bishop Museum, which deals with these pre-contacts where there was no such thing that we, Howley's brought. So we really want to keep that in mind when we talk about that. So going back to where we stopped DeSoto, this is the building that even in its name, it's fully speaking about these naive days of fossil fuel, the carbon building. I put in this champagne bottle that we talked about that the general public nicknamed it after because of its crown being coated with real gold. Now we want to talk about the building that just happened to be completed next to it, at least a year ago, when we sent me out there again to make this a longer stopover with thanks to the hospitality of our patron Dan Kubrick, who hosted me. So here's the building, and looking at it a little bit closer, and I threw in a couple of show quotes up there from my background, having charged myself from the beginning of the new millennium in building buildings that are basically off the grid, carbon neutral, and they have to try really hard in that similar climate, and seeing the sun seasonally as something different, seeing it as an enemy as it is for us all the time to hide away from it in the summer when it's hot. But in the wintertime, all of a sudden it becomes the opposite, your best friend, because it keeps you from getting a frostbite, right? And that is very challenging in a dense city here, because the closer you build, the denser you build, the less sun you get to begin with. So passive solar might be really tough in a high-rise city. The only other thing that comes to my mind could be geothermal, as to keep yourself warm with natural elements here. But the other thing in detail I want to point out, this new thing that we found out in the already past 11 shows, DeSoto, that we say there is sort of an undercut theme thing going on with the architects that try to shave out a certain part of the facade and push it kind of back, that we see here being done too. But that's on the expense of all of a sudden your structure ends up being on the outside, right, before it goes back inside. And that's really hard. Top left, with a kindergarten we did for Germany's oldest university, these frames are structurally and thermally disconnected from the structure behind. But in a high rise where the whole load above you is resting on these columns, you might go through using the same we talked about as in the farmhouse. That's the closest where we did that too, where we carved out something and then we had to use VIP, which is not very important people, but vacuum insulation panels as one of the goodies of our days to make up for that. So my feeling is, DeSoto, I know about you, that all these things weren't of a concern there when designing it. I think these buildings are still stuck in the last century of fossil formalism and try to look pretty, and are kind of ignorant of the signs of our times, if that is fair to say.
I could say that also, too, there are some times where buildings have sections carved out so that they are more stable if there are other forces acting on them, like high winds. So there are times when this is not just a design thing that people want to do for fun, and it isn't just to show off. There are times when you need to do things like that for the safety of an extremely tall building. Yeah, I don't think in this case there's anything performative about it. I think it's just an architectural statement.
We talked about that in the Vista Tower by Jeannie Gang at the beginning of this investigation here. They had to do this as an aftermath fact, as to keep the building stable and has the wind blow through. Once again, it reminds me of our mid-century modern master, Ron Lindgren, that I go through his masterpiece of the Halekulani, where it does that and it can't afford that. That's why it's professionally paradise for me here, because you can do these things. While where Ron is from, where I'm from, where you grew up for a little while, it's not possible, right? So we remember the news on the first slide. It says it makes commute difficult, and commute is one of the other big things, the problem. Thanks for bringing that back, Ash, because transportation is the second after habitation big thing that consumes fossil energy. So you try to minimize that. So you might as well want to live in the city again versus working in some part of the city and living in another part of the city. And that gets us to our next slide. So the next one after the one we've been on, exactly this one here, which is a new housing project in Chicago that we were on the equivalent of our Kalakaua Avenue, which is our glitzy mile or magnificent mile, how they nickname Michigan Avenue, which is officially called here. And it's also fronting the lake at some parts and has all the glitzy stores. So here we are basically walking south. South is usually not where it gets better in terms of social rank. There is the south side of Chicago, which is where when people have less and less money, they go there, which is the equivalent to us going west on the island, where supposedly housing gets cheaper and cheaper. In Omaha, Nebraska, that's North Omaha, where is usually where you said don't have your kids go, because that's where it starts to go dangerous. Well, this building here is not that far out there. So the lake is to our left side in these pictures. And I walked basically down on the Magnificent Mile. And it's by an architect that you and I talked to, our guest Matt from our other show about the Boston Banish booster, who was his mentor and boss for many years before he started to join Banish. And that's Raphael Vignoli, who had just passed away. And condolences to you as well, DeSoto, because been talking about the tragedy of in your family that your 102-year young mother passed away, and now another family member unfortunately joined that, right? You want to talk about that a little bit?
Oh, yeah, just very briefly. My mother, who reached the age of 102, which we're very proud of, passed away in January, but then unexpectedly one of my brothers just died as well from asthma. And while he was 78, he was certainly not the same age that our mother reached. And so these are things to consider, longevity. And we think about longevity not only in human beings, but in people, I mean, in buildings as well, because that's something that is very significant. If you design a building and you build a building well, it will last a long time too. And that's obviously what we want to do. You don't want to build something and then tear it down and put all the energy and work into building something again before that first building has reached the end of its life.
Yeah, and there's also something that's called the sick building syndrome, or we say the opposite, the healthy building syndrome. And we have statistically the longest life expectancy here in Hawaii. We're blessed with that. And that is because of our body doesn't have to power to make up itself for what it feels most comfortable with. So when it gets really cold, like in Chicago, it has to heat itself constantly, get energy into the body, burn calories to do that. And in the wintertime, it has to power against to get too cold, right? And that's why our engines are running so strong and maybe not lasting that long. Here, potentially, we can help with that in using the always very close to our thermal comfort ideal, but we have to do that. As Senator Stanley Cheng's newsletter always comes in like minutes before the show, I forwarded to you already, DeSoto. One of them is a senior housing development in Kaka'ako, where buildings mold and people mold. So that's against that, right? People can, we did a show about the most beautiful Frank Slavsky built in the 60s, social senior housing, where it's easy breezy and it's absolutely wonderful. And then you have these other developments where you lock people away and make them constantly breathe this conditioned air, which is not healthy unless we clean the filters all the time, which mostly we don't do, right? So keep this on.
And that is something that we've talked about before. Sick buildings are the reason for the spread of Legionnaire's disease, which is a sometimes fatal form of pneumonia, which grows in air conditioning systems. And that is something that wasn't discovered until the 1970s, but it recurs every so often. So it isn't just sometimes something that is an inconvenience, it sometimes can kill you.
Yeah, absolutely. So this building here is called the NEMA in Chicago. It's also included in the Dome book. And it's built just recently in 2019. Its architect, again, Raphael Vignoli, Matt's original first boss, just passed away in the same age as your brother. Unfortunately, they did too early, but again, they had a good long life, relatively long life, around the life expectancy. What's the average on the mainland? And so here we look at the building. It is at the end. So in the vista of the canyon, as you see at the bottom right of Michigan Avenue, you look at it and it looks very skinny. But in fact, if you walk around it, once you have, reached it, which you see at the top right, this is from the Fields Museum, that equivalent of your Bishop Museum. And so you see it. And when you see it from the side, it's actually comprised of more of these units, which we learned also from previous shows and the book, a bundle tube construction, where you take a couple of skinny tubes and you bundle them up, and that strengthens their structural integrity. So that's what it is. At the bottom left image, you see when you look close, you see some hope of some indents and cast shadows, which might be outdoor living spaces. And per the saying, never judge a book by the cover and never judge a building by its exterior, because then you're just looking at it postmodernistly as a sculpture, as a form. Let's bring up the next slide and investigate how that building is constructed or composed from the inside. And we have floor to ceiling glass. We look at the beautiful, magnificent skyline of Chicago, of downtown Chicago here. So this is looking from the south up to the north, and that gets us a clue about that fenestration, right? This would be perfect for us in Honolulu. We want that because from the north, we never have to worry about overheating. That is also true for the few summer months that it is pleasant out there. So it's done pretty well. But what about that winter condition, right? You got that cold wind blowing up from that north. And by the way, a passive house that you call what we built the kindergarten to, that energy efficiency standard, you cannot make it entirely out of glass, because glass, even though you take the most cutting edge performing glass, triple pane, argon-filled glass, it can never have the R value, the insulation of a comparable solid wall of other material. So you need to minimize, keep the proportions of the glass close. And you only make it to the south because at that point, the glass can also keep you warm, which is not the case with this glass here at all. So once again, our feeling of that this wasn't designed with climate in mind seems to get confirmed. Again, however, for us, good to hear. It has lanais, which we call them lanais. Here, the question is if that is deep enough to call it a lanai or more a balcony, as it's called over there. But at least it has one. And for us what do we learn from that? If they do this in Chicago for the few months they have where they can do that, we should all have that here in Honolulu, right? And to illustrate the bundle tube construction, you're doing this show quote top left because we had a Lego model, which I gave to the Lego collector and expert Jonathan, and he said it's already worth some little money here because it's a collectible. That's how fast that goes in the collectible worlds, that you are a fellow companion of his, having many collections of all sorts and kinds. So yes, here's the little Lego model that explains to you how, with a Sears Tower now called Willie's Tower, how these individual skinny towers go up and bundled up basically have a better structural integrity. So this slide, while we save the best for next week, that tower in Chicago, we jump to the one that I identified within the next few days here on the island, because I want to introduce this to you and Don Hibbert and Bill Chapman and our student team on the book as maybe the one from the square skinny towers to take, because I got rather fascinated with that one while walking back from my morning workout strolls through Waikiki. This is called the Townhouse Tower. And again, it has a rather small square footprint and is rather tall. But versus who popularized these the most, which is the late Joe Paul Rongstead, he unfortunately got very hermeticized. He actually lived and also died in high age of the mid 80s, and we missed out on interviewing him for one of the shows. Didn't even get him on a Docomomo Talk Story because we missed out on that one. He was then living in the Century Tower, which he decided to make it all hermetic, all glazed, all microwaved. There's some gestural sort of every store is separated by a reveal, and there's supposedly a little flap in there. But that doesn't have enough square inches to get an airflow going. This one here does better because it actually has lanais on the corners. So an advantage of a skinny tower here in our tropics is that you have a small footprint, and usually the corner unit is preferred over the middle unit because it has two exposures and you can get a cross ventilation. These have predominantly one bedroom. So the bedroom and the living room, you can keep the windows open and you get that cross breeze in addition to obviously spending time on that lanai. which there is this bad trend of enclosing them, which also this building here has been victimized by. Also, the other bad trend as well, the pictures from some realtors' website here still show our more preferred and favored vertical guardrail, bar guardrail. They have recently, unfortunately, replaced this with the not so much liked by us glass guardrails. But nevertheless, this is the square skinny tower that I'm suggesting to add to our already pretty full and completed list. But I guess we have one spot left. So for the square skinnies, I'm suggesting that one. How about that, DeSoto?
Well, I'm certainly not going to argue with that. When we talk about skinny towers today, I'm thinking usually of the ones which are very modern and that are even skinnier than this. And those, we have not seen those being constructed here in Honolulu yet, but they do exist in other cities, particularly in the United States, and I'm sure in other locations as well.
That's perfect. Go to them to illustrate what you're saying. Go to the next slide, because here we have them.
Good.
So in the center at the bottom, we see the ones that is also by Vignoli. And that is different than the bundle one in Chicago, the Nima that we just talked about. This is that one, the 432 Park Tower on Park Lane, where we quoted this teen who is on TikTok and who hates it and starts to rant about it. And I guess she has some followers on that one, because there's also lawsuits going on about it being, not so well constructed. And that's something that unfortunately Vignoli had to deal with towards the end of his life. Turning this into a more positive one here, potentially for us, because again, in New York, we have the same climatic conditions than in Chicago. Imagine in the wintertime, that thing sticking out. Another way to, I'm wearing white today, right? White is reflective. So that's good for here all year round. Black, not so much, because it absorbs. Also, you want to basically hunk down in the cold. That's what we automatically do. I talked to Lenny, my son, expert in the medical realm, and he does the same what I do. We kind of try to minimize our body exposure, and we kind of hunk down, and it makes us get a stiff neck in the cold. And so imagine, or the other way to call it, you got to basically protect your extremities. That's why you have gloves on, right? Because if you have your finger sticking out, it gets cold. That is what's happening with this building there, right? All that Arctic cold that comes down from the north is like getting to this tower from all sides, right? And that's a bad thing. And then also, we've been investigating in skinny towers, as you see at the top, from getting away from the clumsy, as we compare it, and no offense to the beautiful, species of elephants, but we don't have them here. We don't need them here unless in the zoo to show the kids how they look like. And even that one is questionable. Should you imprison animals for that reason, right? But that's how buildings metaphorically have been building. So we've been looking at the flamingo legs. And the flamingo, I'm looking at them. We're looking, I think you got the trees in front, but from here, what's right in the middle between you and me in the zoo, there's the flamingo pond. So I'm looking at them and I'm fascinated. How can they stand on one leg at times, right? Buildings to do that. Buildings are not as smart as, the animal life. So the center picture at the, more top part there is where the emerging generation was testing that on the beach. We're all standing on one leg and had a hard time balancing. But then we reached out to each other, and all of a sudden, hey, that was way more easy. And that was a recommendation. If we do all this sort of, a building grove of skinny towers, borrowing from what nature does, as a palm grove, for example, that they keep each other shaded and still keep it aerated enough. Maybe there is connections between the towers, which there's another funny thing in the newsletter of Stanley that picks up on these conspiracy theory people getting to the 15-minute movement, which is very close to me because I grew up like that, and I build components in my hometown to support that, which means you have everything in your neighborhood within the 15 minutes walking distance that you need, so you never need to. And it seems like whenever there's a really good idea, then some people try to take this down, and that's why these conspiracy theorists currently kind of do that, right? So we don't want to believe in that. Well, we think it's good. And while we have buildings only connected on the ground floor, so you always need to go down to go back up and so on. Why not connecting buildings on multiple levels? And that way also then as an effect on the side, basically upgrading the structural integrity, right? At the same time, how does that basically sound? Maybe.
Well, the other thing that you just mentioned, which is true too. If you look, you certainly have taken your students to go to see bamboo groves, and there are other plants and trees that do the same thing, that grow in large clumps. And what happens there, which is comparable to what we're talking about, is they may not be physically connected to each other once they've grown above ground. But what they do, because they are in a clump, they actually structurally assist each other in supporting each other in the face of high winds or, for example, blizzards where there's lots of snow. So you can also see that with conifer forests in the far north, including where you're from in Germany, in which, again, similar trees grow close together, and that breaks the wind to the where it is not as much as one single thing having to deal with the wind, but instead the massing helps strengthen all of them against the force that's going against them by the wind.
That's absolutely right. Perfectly put. So now I'm thinking, well, since we're at the end of another exciting 30 minutes, we need to leave all the other thoughts for next time when we reconvene, and we will put the skinny tower where it originally was with the architect, and we're going to continue here with what we can learn from real nature and how we often get sucked into fake nature, because this is what happened to the building we're going to look next, which also has a sibling here, which is the Queen K hotel right next to me that you can actually see because it's so tall. You see from where you are right now. So stay tuned for that. We will pick you up next time at this point and walk you with us where we're going. But next week, we will have Matt back and going to conclude the town over, his adopted town of Boston, and how we can learn from that. So hopefully Matt stays safe there through the blizzard, through the storm, in his plane, wherever you are. So Matt, stay safe, and we see you and everyone else next week. And until then, stay post-fossily friendly. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for watching Think Tech Hawaii. If you like what we do, please like us and click the subscribe button on YouTube and the follow button on Vimeo. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, and donate to us at thinktechhawaii.com. Mahalo.